session. All right.
Are you about to do a workshop?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. I hope y'all can hear me over on the YouTube. I'm just gonna assume this mic is working. I'm gonna be doing a quick workshop on how to implement sign-on with Ethereum to your application using a couple of different tools that I'll be walking through as we use them. So we'll just start.
Yes. Hey guys, should we move this presentation out of this room? Excuse me, should we move the presentation out of the room?
So I'll be going through the tools as I use them. So I think that will probably be the fastest way to go through this. By the end of this, if you've implemented anything, you should be able to just kind of add this to the finishing touch of your application. What we'll be doing is you'll be able to click on a button, and that button will open up MetaMask and say, hey, do you want to sign into this application? And then if you say yes, we'll go ahead and authenticate that person and add them into like a database. That's what I'll be using in this app, but you could really use this for anything that you're going to be using for your app. And so I'll just go ahead and get started. We're going to be using Remix. Remix is a JavaScript framework similar to Next.js, if you've ever used that before. You could use really anything. It's just an easy way to showcase the functionality without having too much to get in the way. And so you're going to want to use Remix here. And so this will be npm create remix at latest. And we can go ahead and run that. And this should get us an application here. And we'll see how the Wi-Fi holds up.
Can you increase the font size?
Yes. It's like. And this should be initializing a project. The screen's a little bit laggy, nothing's happening right now. I was a little bit worried about, there we go. And so this will ask you a couple different questions. I'm just gonna call this sign in with Ethereum. And we want just the basics, and we're gonna put this on the Remix app server. Remix gives you a lot of different deployment options. We want to run npm install, yeah. And we'll go ahead and create our app here. And after we get this set up, we'll need to do a small bit of configuration, just creating a small little mock database. I'm going to be using SQLite, but if you're using something else like Postgres, that'd be totally fine. Or not at all. You could do all of this authentication on the client if you're not actually creating a product. This is specifically taking any product and just adding authentication with Ethereum. It's not necessarily doing anything on chain. It's just a really nice way for your users to be able to sign into your application and knowing that it's completely secure without taking any personal information like their email or signing in through Google or something like that. What we'll be able to do is have someone sign into your application with just their public key. And that's literally all the information that you're going to take from them. So this is, if you're building any product, really, I think is a really easy way to roll your own authentication without paying anyone else, like any other, like, SaaS services that handle authentication. You don't have to pay them, and you don't have to worry about a lot of the security side of like rolling a traditional auth. It's like email password that can be easily brute forced. So this. If this ever finishes loading, this should just be like a really easy way to just like, hey, I now have users and I can store them in the database and do whatever you would typically do with users. I'll say my internet connection is unstable. That's not great. And I do have a backup if this ends up being a little bit too much of a problem. If I end up dropping or not able to install any packages, because we need to install Ethers, which if you are not familiar with what Ethers is a JavaScript library that just will essentially handle how we're interacting with the blockchain. It's going to be like an ETH plant that we can use in JavaScript. It has a lot of different functionalities. All we're going to be using it for is to sign the message. So that's essentially all we need to authenticate a user is like ask like, hey, can you sign this message? And with that, I can validate that, like, hey, if you were able to sign this message, I now know that you have access to whatever this address is. And since this is taking a little bit longer than I would like, and we have a couple other downloads to do, I'm just going to minimize this. We're going to impromptu a little bit. This is actually, let's see if I can make this VS Code here, because this will be essentially what we are coding up in the first place. So, well, now I see I'm not even screen sharing anymore. I got kicked out of the Zoom meeting. This is not, yeah, that's just me. Well, it seems like I'm still on.
That's been happening quite a bit in other workshops as well.
Yeah, well, it's good that I'm not the only one. They connected me to a Wi-Fi that was not like the main one. Like I think it's localized to this room, but I'm connecting there. Let's see. That would be not great if I can't connect back to this room.
Want to find the host that
Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be great. Thank you, I appreciate that.
So what are you on
I am on, it's Trade Audio 73, which is.
now? Student one.
Yeah, student one.
Student one's fine. Just enter your email. NBC student.
Network preferences. The NBC student.
Yeah. NBC student.
All right, I'll try connecting to that one. It's the Wi-Fi, that Trade Audio 74 Wi-Fi is not. Sorry about that. Let's see. All right. So with that, let's see if we can go back in here. Let's do 5. All right. Okay. Cool. All right. There we go. Awesome. All right. So we're back in business. Hopefully this Wi-Fi. Can you enable screen sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's see if while we're doing that, how this is running. Okay, so that seems to be running quite a bit faster now. So we'll actually continue with this coding demo. Cool. And so we've got, we'll just bring this up. All right. So this should be working all right. Let me go ahead and get that out of the way. I'll make this a little bit bigger for y'all. Okay, I think y'all should all be able to see that. And so this is just like a boilerplate for a remix application. It has a couple of things here. We'll be adding everything in app, but before I do that, I want to just go ahead and install a couple of packages before the Wi-Fi drops. Let's go ahead and bring this up. We can do that later. And so I was talking about ethers. So we'll go ahead and install ethers, and we're also going to be using an ORM. It's an object relational mapping. It's just a way to interact with your database. You don't necessarily have to have this, but will be pretty easy. It gives us a way to kind of view our database a little bit easier. So we'll go ahead and install both of those. And cool. And now what we're going to do is we're going to get a bit of config out of the way. So this will just be Prisma. So we'll do npx Prisma init, and then we have this flag data source provider. I think the default for this is Postgres, but we're just going to put in SQLite. And here you can see it adds a Prisma folder, and this is the schema for your database. And so you can see here that it's fully in SQLite, and then we have this JavaScript client that we'll interact with. What we'll do is we'll just create a model that's a user, and this will just really be one row. It's going to be an address that's a string, and that will also function as our ID. And that's literally all we need for this. And we can go ahead and push this up by doing npx prisma db push. And this will upload our schema to this .dev db file. And so this is essentially just our database right here. So it's the file. And Prisma also gives us a tool that lets us kind of view our database. So we'll do npx prisma studio. And that will pull this up. And so you can see just on port 555, we can see that we have users. And so whenever we go through this successfully, we'll be able to increment this, and you'll see that, hey, cool, we have users in our database. And so we'll just keep that going in the background. And in another terminal, we're going to do npm run dev. This is going to start our dev server on localhost 3000. So we'll go ahead and open that up as well. And so here you can see this is, full screen up, you can go through. Okay. So you can see here that this is just a remix app. It's just some HTML. It has some basic stuff to like the remix docs and a couple of tutorials. We're going to be creating a login route. And so you can see right now we don't have that implemented. We're getting a 404 not found, so we need to implement a login route. Wrong way. And to do that in apps, you can see we've got this route folder. And so all of our routes are files. You can imagine like Next.js has file-based routing. This is actually using React Router under the hood, and it's actually the team behind this. But what we're going to do is create a new folder, and this is just going to be login will be the folder, and in login, we're going to create a index.tsx, and this is what it'll pull on that base login route. So we'll just say export default function login, and then we will just return say h1 tags gm, and we'll save this, and we should have our route up now. If we refresh, cool. You can see we've got GM here. So the next thing that we'll want to do is create a button. And for that, we'll go ahead and just wrap this. So we've got GM, and then we'll also have a button here that says sign in. Sure. Save that. Also have one parent element. Okay, we can just make a nice fragment here. Awesome, cool. And so now if we go back over here, and we're in login, nothing was returned from this render. You may have crashed it. And restart. Here. Oh, this usually means the return statement was missing. Oh, it's because I don't know when I saved, it just says return. That's not what we want. We want to return. We save. There's a semicolon here. There we go. And so here we've got our nice little sign in button, but you can see it's just a button, nothing's happening, we're clicking on it, that's great. So now we're gonna need to get a function here. And to make sure that we're not having a lot of these typo errors, I'm actually gonna pull, this is from Quicknode Labs. I have this entire repo that we're building on GitHub. If you wanna fork this or clone it, it's Quicknode Labs sign-on Ethereum, gets you all of this at the end of the day. So if you want to just skip all the learning bits and just have a button that connects it, that's cool. But so you can see what we're doing here is I'll grab just this function here, this get web3 function, and we'll walk through this little bit of code here. So I'll also go in our login route, or our login file, as it were. And so cool, we've got this get web3, and we're going to need a couple additions here. So we'll also grab all of our import statements and types that we're using. And we will open that up. All right, and so you can see here, there's a couple of bits that we haven't made yet that we'll get around to, but you can see that we're importing ethers, and then we're grabbing a couple of hooks that Remix gives us. This is something you can ignore if you're in JavaScript, but if you're in TypeScript, it's going to start barking at you whenever you use window Ethereum. Window.ethereum is, as you mentioned, like the global window object that you have access to in JavaScript. MetaMask specifically is just a .ethereum, is just an additional object on the window that you have access to. And so here we're just extending the window interface to say, hey, you can have this thing called Ethereum, because otherwise it's going to be like, hey, what is .ethereum? That doesn't exist. And so on this get web3 function, we're saying, hey, if window.ethereum, because Ethereum is only going to exist if the person has MetaMask installed. So if they don't have it installed, we're throwing an error saying, hey, it's not here, you need to go install MetaMask. But we're going to use ethers here to create a JavaScript client. And so we've got this const provider is a new ethers provider, and it's a web3 provider, and you're just going to call that window.ethereum. And so now you have plugged into that RPC, whatever RPC that the person on MetaMask is using, that's the one it's going to grab. So this will also grab, you have like access to the chain, like if you were saying like, hey, this is only a test app, I want to make sure that no one is going to like be able to send funds or something with their MetaMask. You could put chain restrictions here. You could say like, hey, if the ID is not, like Polygon Mumbai, throw an error. And so once we have that object, that provider, we're connected to the blockchain, we have the ability to send a request. And so MetaMask has this API where it's ETH request accounts. And so this will essentially, whenever you click the button, MetaMask is going to be able to pick this up and say like, hey, this application wants access to MetaMask, and it will return a bunch of different accounts. And so we're asking it, hey, once we have that, we get the pop-up there, we're going to ask to get a signer. So once we have the signer, we want to get the address of this, whoever the signer object is, your user, essentially. And then we're creating this nonce variable. This is just going to be a random number every single time. And then I'm going to say, hey, will you sign this message that's just this random variable? And if they say yes, cool, we're going to return the address of our user, the signature that they generated whenever they signed the message, which is the nonce. And then we're going to also return that nonce. And with those three things, we're going to be able to actually authenticate our user. That's all you need to be able to confidently say like, hey, this person has access to this address. And so I'll hop back over here to get the plumbing, but I want to say if I just click on a button, if I just add on click right here, and we say get web3, this won't on click. So this won't do exactly what we want it to, but you can see if with just that little function here, if we click sign in, I would expect it to pop up MetaMask actually. Let's see, get web3. Oh, what is it saying? It's giving us a string. Get web3 is an async function. On click get web3. So there is something going on here. Parsing error. That is definitely an issue. You don't want that.
So you should take out the parentheses on get web3.
Yeah. So everything else is just around modules that we aren't using. So I would expect this. There you go, cool. So we clicked on get web3, and you can see here that MetaMask, we're getting an account. And so whatever account that we're logged into currently, since you can have multiple accounts in your MetaMask, whichever one you're currently using, it's grabbing that address. And you can see this is the nonce that we're generating. If we don't actually sign this, you can see every time we click this, that this is just going to be a different message every time. We can click sign, but nothing happens. We returned all of those things, but we didn't do anything with it. So now we need to actually do something with it. And so what we're going to do is we can go ahead and pull out this get web3. We'll just leave that blank for the time being. And we'll go back over to our repo here. And you can see we're going to pull in this action function. We're just going to pull in this entire thing, if I can grab all of it. And so action functions are an idea that happens, or that is exclusive to Remix. You can think of, there's two functions that you have access to in any of your routes. When you're building a Remix application, your routes are really where you're going to have all of your API logic. Your route is your API. And so whenever you want to send data to your server to do something with it, you're going to call an action. And since we're exporting it, there's a bit of magic that's happening behind the scenes where it's saying, hey, I know the function's called action. Whenever we call this, we're going to send all of that over to the server to do something with it. And so here, what is happening? How about that? You can see the API for this is actually just, if you're familiar with developing applications, we're just grabbing a form. And we're going to essentially populate this form with the address, the signature, and the nonce that we got earlier from that get web3 function. We're going to create a virtual form, and we're going to submit that form up to our server that will then perform the authentication. And so you can see here, we're using this request form data. And from that form, we're getting the address, we're getting the signature, and we're getting the nonce. And then here is just a bit of type checking, where it's saying like, hey, we need to do all of these things. And then you can see here that we've got this is authenticated variable, and we're calling this authenticate function, but we haven't actually added this authenticate function yet. So let's go ahead and go do that. If we go to the top here, we can see that this is expecting to be in login. And so here in the app, we're going to create a login.ts, and this is just going to handle all of our authentication logic. And so again, all of this is here in the repo. We'll go through and we'll walk through this login function. We'll go ahead and get this in VS Code so that it's a little bit easier to look at here. Come on, time, we're at 30, okay. And so here, again, in login, we're using ethers, and we're expecting, hey, the address, the signature, and the nonce. And it's a function where we have this authenticated value is false by default. So if we don't set this to true, this function will always return false, which is good. If you don't authenticate your users, you don't want to tell your server that they're authenticated. So by default, it's false. And then we have ethers has this utility library. And in that utility library, we have this verify message function. And what that's going to do is it's going to get us the address. So like I said earlier, if we have the signature of somebody signed a message, it generated a signature, and we give it what it signed, which in this case is just the nonce as a string. We can pass it those two for the verify message, and it will return us, hey, if this is what was generated, it had to be from this public key. And so we have your address here essentially. And so we can then go back through here. And since we're taking the original address from MetaMask, we're saying like, hey, we can then compare, does this address match the address that I got from my verify message function? So I can say, hey, if these two are the same, then we're going to set authenticated to be true. And then we'll just return that boolean. And so over here, you can see that we're sending this form, and it's going to say like, hey, is authenticated. So we're using this, which is returning a boolean value. And after we get that, whether it's true or false, it's going to run that and give us either a true or false value. And if it's false, we're just going to return. We don't want to do anything further. We're exiting the function. But if they are authenticated, we want to create them as a new user in our database. And so this DB, this is Prisma here, is this db.user. User is our model that we have. And then every single model has a bunch of functions that Prisma gives us. And so we're just going to create a new person, and then we're going to pass it some data. And you can remember from our model earlier that it's our users only have one thing in them, it's an address. So we're gonna say, hey, the address is this. And then after that, we create the user. We're gonna redirect them to another page. So right now, we just have that login route. Typically, whenever you are in an application and you log in, that's not the route that you're on. You're on like, hey, user, and then your user ID. So we're just gonna say login and then your user address. And so we're gonna need to create that route as well. But let's just go ahead and see if all of this is working. The only thing here is request as any. So we're getting a type error here, and I don't particularly want to deal with that. So we're just gonna TS ignore right here and get that out of the way. And we're also don't have this utils DB server, which is gonna cause a problem since we're calling this DB object. And so we're gonna need to create that as well. And so in this folder, under app, we're going to create a utils folder, and then we're going to create a db.server.ts. And this .server here is, again, a little bit of remix magic. If it has this .server in it, it is only going to execute on the server. It's not going to bundle any of its dependencies and ship it over to the client. So that's just a bit of performance benefits that you're getting here, and making sure that you're not exposing accidentally any of that as well. So again, back here, we're going to go to our utility library. I'm not going to walk through this bit here. Just know that this is essentially creating a connection pool where whenever we're updating in development, we're going to pick up our old connection. But if we're in production, we're going to open up a new connection. This just so I don't spin up, like 5 different connections to my database on my local machine here. But with that, you can see we're just exporting that, and we should be able to from here. Looks good to me. And now we're going to go back to the login function. So routes, login, and on that index, you can see here that we have, instead of where I was saying, hey, we want to use Web3, we're going to handle submit. And that handle submit is a function here. So we're going to copy this bit right here. We will add that to our login function. And so here you can see we've got this view submit hook, and this is a remix hook that just allows us to virtually submit our form. Typically, if you're filling out a form as a user, you would see the form. You would say, hey, I'm going to type in my first name, Noah, last name, Hein, here's my email address, and I'm going to click submit. We're not doing that. All of that's happening on MetaMask. Whenever we sign that message, we want to send all of that to the server. So this is a hook that lets us send all of that without there being an explicit form HTML element here. And so on the button, we're going to say onclick handle submit. And let's make sure that, yeah, did I mean handle? There's a typo here. There is no I in submit before the B. There you go, handle submit. Cool. And it looks like there's I missed the closing parentheses there. Awesome. And so now if we're back in our app here, and we're in our login function, we're going to click sign in. Hopefully. Let's see if we're getting any errors here. Let's go back to the terminal. We're getting login. Cool. Let's handle submit. Refresh this. Let's go ahead and looks like I'm not getting anything there. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. So what I'm going to do to save us a bit of time from debugging is I'm just going to copy this, and I will delete this whole guy right here. Bit of copy paste magic right here. And we've got binding request as any type. Let's go ahead and add our ignore right here again. To make sure that we're still running our server. Cool. bottom. Awesome. And we sign in. I'm getting could not resolve remix. Interesting. But we created this. Let's see where it's. Action function is only used, so we don't need that. Well, that's a type. It's not bad. Let's go ahead and save us a little bit of time. I already got the database configured. I'm not sure why Remix needs to be installed, since that's how that started. We've got our Remix run dependencies here. We've got the dev. There we go. So that's something that changed, I guess, since the last time, is where we import things from. There we go. And with that saved, let's try and import node uSubmit is not a function. So it looks like there's some different dependencies since the last time I built it out. I made some breaking changes. So what I'm going to do really quick, let's count my own time. I'm going to give time for y'all to answer any questions. So what we'll do here is I will actually just kill this. We'll kill this too. And then we're going to do what I imagine y'all will do if we're actually, like just working this project. And so you should be able to get a decent idea from that. What is bonus? So we'll get boom. Sign on Ethereum, and we'll go ahead and open this up. And before we already have this Prisma, we have our user here. So the only thing we need to do in this project is just those initial uploading really quick. So it's npx Prisma db push, and then npx Prisma studio. No rows in the statement. That's fine. We'll get to that when we get there. So we'll just keep going through the app that I was in. Since we had our login, we were in this index function, and all of this was running at ts ignore. Awesome. And from here, it would help if we installed this one. Yeah. Wi-Fi seems to be working a bit better this time. Cool. And let's go ahead and run that again. Database not found, database URL. That's all right. I'll worry about that in a second here. Let's see if I run this. Well, I'm really not sure. I did this literally an hour before I got up here, and this was working just fine. So for the sake of getting through the rest of this, I'll actually just run through the code, because that's really I'm sure a lot of y'all aren't building on Remix, you're probably building in Next or whatever, whether you're doing server side using like Ruby or PHP or Node, whatever it is. This should be portable across all of them. Was this address, the signature, and the nonce, and specifically on our index here of the MetaMask API being right here. So what you'll want to do is really all of it is in this get web3 function. which is just returning all of those. And then in that authenticate function that we walked through earlier, where it's like, hey, I have all of this, and then you have the verify message function where you're able to then check your decode address with the actual address that we grabbed from MetaMask and making sure that those are the same. Because that's at the end of the day, if those are the same, your user is authenticated, and what you do with it, at that point, I was just going to use Prisma and take a look at that. That's the only thing that we skipped, is just like, hey, from here, use Prisma and just generate a user in your database. So you're probably not using Prisma as well. You're probably just writing SQL or using a different ORM, whatever ORM you're using for whatever language you're in. You just want to take that and be like, hey, with this address, just create a user here. And we can then lock down all of those routes. And that's a really easy way for you to then get users on your platform, because you saw all you need to do is click on a button and sign a message that says like, hey, do you agree? I used a not for my example, and that's just to make sure that it stays random. But you could also make that like agree to your terms of service. You can have MetaMask pop up and say like, hey, here's our terms of service. Here's a link here. You know, check this out. If you sign this message, you are agreeing to our TOS here. And from that, you've authenticated them, and it's kind of like two birds, one stone in your registration process. And especially if you're building a product that's maybe not like on-chain, like it's not a DeFi app, but you know that people that are crypto native want to be using your product, this is a very friendly way to authenticate them, because you aren't taking any personal information. Your database is just going to consist of a bunch of public keys. And, you know, like maybe a user wants to create 4 different accounts, and they don't want you as your product to be able to track them across all of it. It's a very friendly way for you to add them. And so here, the take homes for this is really like, hey, you can grab from this MetaMask or this window.ethereum object. You can then say like, hey, do you want to sign this message? And if so, we can return all of this and then authenticate it. And I'll just really quickly run through this, which is just loading in the user address from that page previously. This was another little remix oddity where you have access to the params for any request that you're sending. So if you're saying like, hey, login / 0x, you can then add that, and you have access to that from Remix, and you can make sure you can lock down if you wanted to use like cookies. That would be a decent way to like, hey, I'm gonna, whenever they click on that button and you return all of that object, or you return all of that info to your server and you run the authentication, you could then add an additional step that's saying like, hey, if this is running through and we're saying we're going to create this user, you can also create like a session storage or a cookie that's saying like, hey, this is their stuff, and you can then lock down all of the routes so that people can't look at anybody else's public address. Like if you're showing like a portfolio tracker, obviously someone else could implement that, and your data there isn't safe if it's tied to your public address. Someone else can always look at your assets, but if you want to create that additional like friction of saying like, hey, you know, I get it, all of this is public, and you could take a look at all of this, but I'm not going to give you that additional functionality from my app, in this case being like a portfolio tracker where it's showing like, hey, here's a breakdown of all of their assets and all of their activity. And it's like, if you want all of that information, you go build it yourself. All right, I'm not going to give that information to you and let you look into someone else's. You can then lock down all of the routes so that people can, you know, upload and be like, hey, I can see all of my assets and still feel good that like, while all of that data is public, you know, no one is going to use this platform specifically to look at all of them. As you know, not keeping anyone from creating or like forking your project and showing other people's all that info. There are services I know that do that now, where it's like, hey, a lot of like the whale watcher services, like, hey, look at this whale's portfolio, and it's going to give you like a breakdown of all their activity. But that's just an example of like what you may use this for, and how at that point you really just have users and you can do whatever you want with it. You just are crypto native in the sense that you're not taking a lot of personal data from them. And you may see that more people are interested in your product that way. It's like, hey, maybe I don't want to give my email out to, you know, the 900th person. And this way, not only am I not giving them any personal info, I'm also not letting them like send me messages. You know, notifications are something that a lot of companies are working on being able to send notifications to people's, you know, like wallets. But at the end of the day, this is a way to just I don't have to check all of that. The app is there whenever I want it, and I know that like my digital kind of fingerprint is really minimized on applications that are implementing this, and that's just a very secure way because you know that no one's going to be able to brute force their way to any of the private data that you're hosting on your application. And so I'll end it there. If y'all have any questions, I am sorry that I didn't actually get through all of this, but you hopefully get an idea here that if you're forking this, you'll just need to install all of the dependencies and then run through that bit of the Prisma config where you're just saying like, hey, generate all of this to a database and make sure that we're accepting these users. And that's really it. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. If y'all have any questions, I'd be open to taking any. And if not, continue hacking. I hope y'all enjoyed it. And yeah, that's it. I'll just wrap it up.
Okay, so when you say that you limit the amount of exposure via
Yeah, absolutely. And so your question is like, how would you go about like locking down like routes, like specifically? Yeah, so like you have the sense this is not something that is done right here, but what I would point you to is if you're following this specifically, it's the next V1 dots. And so here, you can see what I had this save on their docs. So you can see really running is the website that you would use for all of this, and this will save you like a long time, especially if you're newer. This does a lot of the plumbing for you, where it's like, hey, it's kind of when I was newer, it's not really clear where one thing ends and the next thing begins. And this does a lot of that. So it's kind of like the glue for several different things, and so it kind of narrows the amount of things that you have to worry about. So for here, what I do is routes.
and as a follow-up question, do you think it would be feasible for someone to pick up this documentation today and at the stage what it their current project?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, then yeah.